The Legislative Assembly's first few weeks in session had been brief but eventful. Feuillants and Jacobins were still at odds with each other, but had largely coaligned on the need for a hardline response to three key issues: refractory priests, émigré nobles, and the suspensive veto. Each would have to be dealt with in turn. First things first, what to do about those turbulent priests? Confined to the countryside, refractory priests festered like a bloated boil on the kingdom's flank. As they railed against the government and its suppression of the church, their words found ready listeners among the masses of disenfranchised and disillusioned rural peasantry. With each passing day, the legitimacy of the Legislative Assembly was sapped and the refractors gained traction. Hardliners in the Jacobin Club leapt into action. To lance the boil, they took inspiration from the National Assembly's prior arrangement with the clergy, the civil constitution of the clergy, or more specifically, the Civic Oath. In November, the Legislative Assembly reissued the Civic Oath, emphasizing the loyalty to the revolution part. French clergymen were given 1 week to reiterate their loyalty. Though pretty well all of the already loyal priests complied, a vast majority of the refractory priests refused. But that's okay, because as much had been expected. Their rejection of the oath a second time now carried real consequences. By Assembly decree, a committee of inspection was established to investigate those refractory priests who by both word and deed were disloyal to the constitutional order. Should the committee find a priest guilty of having fomented dissent, they could be stripped of all station and deprived of their pensions and salaries. Pierre-Joseph Cambon went one step further and recommended that non-juring priests be exiled. Hard times had warranted hard lines. Likewise, the hard line was winning out in the solution to the émigré problem. Severe measures, including confiscation of property and renunciations of inheritance, had been enforced on those who failed to heed the king's recall to France. But it was now becoming clear that these measures were inadequate. Jacobin rhetoric around the issue didn't leave them any room to back down, so Brissot jumped at the opportunity to raise the stakes. Already, he had made specific denunciations of foreign kingdoms harbouring émigrés. It was now that Brissot began to shift away from mere denunciations to threats of war. Unabashedly hawkish, Brissot used his platform within the Legislative Assembly to push for war with two neighbouring states in particular, the Archbishopric of Trier and the Duchy of Mainz. Both were minor German satellites of the Holy Roman Empire, ostensibly under imperial protection. As neighbours of France, and as predominantly Catholic states, Mainz and Trier provided asylum for many émigré nobles displaced by the revolution. And it was from within these states that many émigrés organised their plots for aristocratic resurgence, issued orders to agents provocateurs, and sent emissaries out to the courts of Europe, entreating kings and queens for support in a war to restore the Bourbons. Already, they had amassed a hilariously small army of some 4,000 personnel, led by the Prince of Condé, 3,994 officers, and 6 very unfortunate enlisted soldiers. Brissot's argument was that by providing succour to the émigrés, Mainz and Trier were complicit in their attempts to destabilise the constitutional order. In order to punish them and to put an end to the émigrés, the French army had to march east, across the Rhine frontier. Moreover, there were domestic woes that Brissot argued could be put to bed by war. A short war would reveal any half-hearted or even traitorous individuals in their midst. Uncommitted or wavering delegates were under particular scrutiny. And hopefully, war might just liven up the people, give them a cause to get behind and encourage support for the government. Of course, these were pretty flimsy excuses for an invasion. No recognised casus belli was present, and the French people weren't exactly straining for war. Furthermore, a solid portion of the delegates were very reticent. In part because France's economy was still in shambles, but also because there was the very real possibility that such a war would spiral out of control. And yet Brissot insisted. Trier and Mainz were low-hanging fruits, and the short, sharp war needed to pluck them would, he argued, reinvigorate the revolutionary zeal of the people. Brissot spent November absolutely hammering this point. He was helped along by Cambon, who took proactive steps to rectify France's colossal debt. His most important contribution, among many, was to compel the Assembly to consolidate all state debt into a single list. This process would be completed by the next year, resulting in the creation of the Great Book of the Public Debt. Combined with austerity measures, this allowed Cambon and the Ministry of Finance to more efficiently manage the state debt. So with pressure relieved on the economic side of things, the Legislative Assembly began to respond more positively to Brissot's hawkish haranguing. However, Brissot still faced a major impediment. What would the king have to say? According to the Constitution, the right of declaring and ending war was still a royal prerogative. The Legislative Assembly needed Louis's permission. By late November, Brissot had the numbers, he had the money, he just needed the king. With bipartisan support, The Legislative Assembly sent a delegation to the king on the night of November 29th to officially request royal approval for war. They got it, but it was to be a hollow victory. The payoff was that Louis was permitted to counter with a veto, fully blocking the new civic oath issued back on the 9th. Better late than never, the king had weighed in on the issue of refractory priests, decisively on their side. Ordinarily, this might have been the cause for a major crisis. But if they wanted their war, and they really did, they needed Louis. They had to let the new civic oath fall by the wayside, for now. Caving, the delegation moved on to the need for war. Hearing them out, Louis defied expectations by giving a short but quite sincere yes. His reasons for doing so were suitably cynical. He thought France would lose, and thus the revolution would be undone. So there it is, the green light. The Legislative Assembly, should it desire, could drag France into a royally sanctioned war. But here's the catch. Just how big would this war be? As members of the Holy Roman Empire, Trier and Mainz had their sovereignty and territories guaranteed by Austria. In this case, should France invade, Austria would be legally bound to counter-declare on France, likely plunging Europe into a large and no doubt very costly war. So the real question was, would Austria be willing to fight France? It was an open question, for a number of reasons. A diplomatic revolution in miniature had occurred in the Holy Roman Empire in recent months. Austria, under Archduke Leopold II, had found itself increasingly aligned with its powerful northern neighbour, Prussia, ruled by Kaiser Frederick Wilhelm II, as both rulers fretted about the revolutionary direction in France. Following the bilateral Treaty of Reichenbach, lingering disputes over territories had been settled with the exchange of some bits and pieces of land. This budding friendship was also strengthened by three big shifts in European diplomacy. Firstly, Prussia happily cuddled up to Austria after having been largely abandoned by her longtime ally, Great Britain. Remember that mess in the Netherlands where a brief civil war had broken out? Well, the English refused to take the Prussian side in support of the Orangists, which forced Prussians to take action unilaterally, making them look like an unwanted interloper into what Europe viewed as a strictly Dutch affair. Secondly, Austria was happy to cuddle up to the Prussians to secure their northern flank. The Ottoman Empire and the Habsburgs were once again at war, necessitating the Austrian army relocate massive amounts of men and material to their southern militarized frontier in Hungary. Campaigns against a northern and southern neighbour simultaneously would be too much for the Austrians to bear, and thus it was necessary to placate the Prussians. The third great shift occurred further east. That sleeping giant, the Russian Empire, was an ever-present threat. Following the third and final partition of Poland, an uneasy truce had existed between Prussia, Austria and Russia. But Russia was rapidly growing at the expense of her neighbours. Once again, war was being waged in the Balkans and the Caucasus between the Ottomans and the Russians, and once again, it seemed like Russian victory was inevitable. Moreover, the Poles were agitating for a constitution within Russian-controlled Poland, meaning that this movement would soon spread into those Polish lands annexed by the Prussians and the Austrians. So in order to present something of a united front against a potential bout of Russian expansion in Eastern Europe and the threat posed by a budding constitutionalist revolt in Poland, both the Austrians and Prussians agreed to put aside their differences. So this all suffices to say that the Emperor's eyes were briefly focused east, away from France. But Brissot refocused his gaze. Leopold once again returned his attentions to France. And yet, even with the maltreatment of the Bourbons and French anti-clericalism, the Emperor was more than willing to sit back and watch the fireworks. From his perch in Vienna, he had watched France's descent into revolutionary chaos with unbridled glee, viewing it as something like karmic justice for decades of criminal mismanagement and oppression under the Ancien regime. After all, Leopold viewed himself as the model of a modern European ruler, enlightened, fair, traditional, and loyal to Rome. As far as he was concerned, Louis's plight was the result of his failure to rule with decency and tact. For this reason, attempts by the émigrés to sway the emperor towards diplomatic sanction or military action against the constitutional order had thus far been ignored. France and Austria were, after all, allies, bound together by treaty and by royal marriage. But that did not mean, however, that Leopold was unsympathetic to his brother-in-law. The emperor believed that the civil constitution of the clergy, as well as the constitution of 1791, were grave injustices visited upon a fellow monarch. Such insults could not go unanswered. But it was June 1791 that signalled the true tipping point for the emperor, when he quietly reversed course and determined that something had to be done to contain the revolution. His decision was informed by two major events: the flight to Varennes and the consequent deterioration of relations between the Empire and France. Now, the flight to Varennes certainly had the tacit approval of Leopold, and should Louis have succeeded, he would have found refuge within Austria. But Louis did not succeed. What emerged in the aftermath of his retrieval was a roiling milieu of conspiracy theories, rumours and agitations that cast grave doubts upon the Franco-Austrian alliance. Claims of Austrian involvement and the inescapable gravity of the failed flight steadily eroded their relationship. Mutual doubt metastasized into mutual disdain. Such a strained relationship could not last long. The Franco-Austrian alliance of 1756 was coming apart at the seams. In light of the developing situation in Paris and the deteriorating relationship between Austria and France, Leopold crafted a diplomatic response to the crisis, a few steps short of the expected military intervention championed by the émigrés and expected by the French. As part of a new policy of open hostility to the constitutional order, Leopold issued a kind of diplomatic call to arms called the Padua Circular. Contrary to expectation, no other major state took up the offer. Great Britain was non-interventionist by temperament, Russia was busy and no friend to the empire. Spain was friendly with the Bourbons, but concerned with colonial and domestic affairs. Everyone else was either too minor or too preoccupied to care, much less intervene. Leopold's neutrality turned hostility was a bust. But there was one respondent. Prussia rejoins the picture here because Kaiser Frederick Wilhelm was similarly alarmed by the flight to Varennes, but saw little he could do unilaterally to help the Bourbons. But after the Padua Circular, Frederick Wilhelm spied an opportunity to take an oppositional pose to the constitutional order. If Reichenbach was the basis of their rapprochement, the Declaration of Pillnitz, signed in August of 1791, was the beginning of what both monarchs expected to be a fruitful new era. The great frenemies of Central Europe recommitted to preserving imperial borders, a mutual defensive pact, and a few other minor things. But the centerpiece of Pillnitz was a clause that stipulated Prussia and Austria would jointly invade France should the royal family be put in danger. This was, as you might expect, a provocative escalation. But just as the Prussians and the Austrians were ratcheting up the heat, things were cooling down in France. This is around the time where the partisan divide between the left and right was gearing down, and the mass of French politics was settling in the centre. The Friends of 1789 were clamping down on the rising tide of republicanism, culminating in the massacre at the Champ de Mars, and had settled upon a political compromise between government and the king. So really, the wind had been taken out of Austria's sails. There was no real need for intervention anymore. And good thing too, because Leopold had absolutely no intention of going through with any sort of military action at all. It was all a bluff. The assurances made at Pillnitz were smoke and mirrors, made to deter the National Assembly and provide a better pretext for war should Austria deem it necessary. But written into the fine print was a stipulation that Austria would only intervene if all major European powers condoned an intervention, an impossibility in the climate of mutual suspicion and mistrust that permeated European diplomacy after the collapse of the alliances post-1765. So Leopold had deliberately intended to renege on his commitment to intervention. His main reason for doing so was military in nature. The Austrian army was in shambles. Austria had never enjoyed a particularly stellar military record, and recent experiences in the Balkans had demonstrated a severe lack of cohesion, coordination and leadership at all levels of the armed forces. But what was most sorely lacking was supplies. Men, materials, horses, food, muskets, ammunition, boots, clothing. The army was barely capable of holding the line against the Ottomans. A war with the French army, even so diminished by desertion and disunity, would be disastrous. This is the fundamental reason why it was an open question as to whether or not Austria would defend Mainz and Trier. All this brings us back to 1791, when this tenuous peace was threatened by the establishment of the Legislative Assembly. Brissot happily self-appointed himself Hawk-in-Chief for the Jacobins and advocated for direct military action against foreign enemies in order to finish off the émigrés. Brissot's hardline warmongering was winning over undecided delegates and depriving the Feuillants of support and strength with each passing session. However, that's not to say that there wasn't a concerted effort made to combat this jingoism. A major voice of dissent emanated from fellow Jacobin Maximilien Robespierre. A cautious, hesitant man by nature, he knew full well that Brissot's promises of a short, decisive war were vapid flights of fancy. The few Jacobin doves under Robespierre worked tirelessly to counteract the tipping of the scales in favour of the Jacobin hawks. Robespierre himself usually making some fairly dry and dispassionate retorts to Brissot's fiery addresses. So in the matchup between the two, it was little contest. The scales were tipped firmly in favour of the Hawks when Feuillants liberal nobles retired from the National Assembly parroted back Brissot's talking points in editorials and speeches. They did this not so much out of agreement, but because war was a prime opportunity to receive military appointments. appointments which only required royal approval and not dicey elections, and they carried hefty salaries to boot. Chief among these liberal nobles was the Comte de Narbonne, elected Minister of War in December. Narbonne was an old-guard liberal noble and rose to the ranks of the army and led the National Assembly by merit and personal connections. As far as Narbonne saw it, the constitutional order was flimsy and could do with a brief but conclusive little war to generate some faith in the Legislative Assembly. Now, this split in the Jacobin club between hawks and doves was the basis for the formation of yet another political club, the Girondins. Deriving their name from the Gironde region of southern France, where many of their initial membership came, the Girondins were a direct offshoot of the Jacobins. It'd be more accurate to call them Jacobin hawks. They fundamentally agreed with the Jacobins on that most sacred tenet: carry forth the revolution. It was really in terms of means, not motive, that they differed so sharply. Only later on would the divide become more concrete, between monarchists and republicans, free market capitalists and state interventionists. For now, the movement fully revolved around Brissot, and as the movement galvanized around his force of personality and warmongering rhetoric, the Girondins embraced Brissot's brand of revolutionary radicalism. Thus the club had an explicit ideological mission. Girondins wanted to export the revolution on the end of a bayonet if need be. War was the best means of exporting this revolution: invade a foreign nation, sweep aside its version of the Ancien regime, and install a new revolutionary government. In short order, a majority of the Jacobins became ready converts to Girondin jingoism. Though most would retain nominal membership in the Jacobin club, they could devote fully their energies and faculties to the prosecution of the war. So all told, the club was well connected and well led, with dozens of influential members claiming membership. Brissot had another powerful ally, fellow Jacobin and newly elected mayor of Paris, Jérôme Pétion, who used his power and influence to circulate pro-Girondin newspapers and silence Robespierre's doves. As a cumulative result of Brissot's ceaseless warmongering, the Legislative Assembly was pushed inexorably down the well-trodden path to war. Louis sauntered down to the Manège on December 14th and to thunderous applause proclaimed his support for war. An ultimatum had already been issued to Trier and Mainz: willingly surrender the émigrés within 1 month, or be compelled to do so by force. And just guess what little Mainz and Trier did upon receiving the ultimatum. Hopelessly outmatched and not at all sure of Austrian support, they immediately capitulated. They did so unconditionally and fully committed to removing the émigrés. Brissot and his allies were left completely gobsmacked by the capitulation. Robespierre, Barnave and other doves breathed a strained sigh of relief. War had, it seemed, been narrowly averted. But then the Austrians caught whiff of the ultimatum. Leopold answered the open question of Austria's willingness to fight. In no uncertain terms, he issued an ultimatum of his own to the French: retract your ultimatum forthwith, or be invaded. A transparent bluff? Almost certainly. A shrewd political move? Not so much. When the Legislative Assembly heard the Austrian sabre rattling on New Year's Eve, it sent reverberating shockwaves all throughout France. In one fell swoop, all the remnant dovish, cautious rhetoric that counseled against war was quashed in the face of official confirmation of Austria's long-suspected bellicose and malign intentions. All those conspiracy theories, most of them total fabrications, were given new life in the minds of the public and, most importantly, the delegates of the Legislative Assembly. January was marked by a flurry of activity from the Girondins, who found little resistance to a new plan they formulated. If Mainz and Trier were no longer targets, well, why not the Austrians? Certainly, they had a big army, but they stood little chance against the full might of renewed French arms. Perhaps Austria could furnish them with a brief but decisive war. Besides, such a foul indignation as this ultimatum could not go unpunished. So Austria was now set squarely in the sights of the hawkish Girondins, and war once again seemed inevitable. The Legislative Assembly made a request of the king that month, asking that he issue an ultimatum back to the Austrians. The usual back off, quit your sabre-rattling, tough talk we've seen before. Well, Louis agreed, being as he was keen for a doomed war that he thought would unseat the constitutional order. So he had one of his ministers draft the ultimatum. Meanwhile, the Legislative Assembly spent February making preparations for war. The raising of new battalions, stockpiling of provisions, and devising an offensive strategy. But then, once again, everything changed in an instant. 2 messages arrived in Paris on March 1st. The first was overshadowed by the second. Leopold II had died. With the throne still warm, Francis II made preparations for his inauguration as Archduke. Elections to determine who would be the next emperor would follow, but inevitably Francis would win. Habsburgs dominated the elections. A young man of 24, he had neither the diplomatic credentials of his father nor his rational, enlightened worldview. Francis was ill-equipped to handle what was a rapidly deteriorating diplomatic situation. But even if he had been, it was by now too late. That was the first message. A second ultimatum reiterated Austria's willingness to fight should the French refuse to back down. Leopold's final act had been a grave, terrible miscalculation. As before, it merely seemed to confirm that Austria's intentions were hostile, and any lukewarm delegates felt compelled to throw their lot in with the Hawks because, after all, war was now inevitable. So instead of suffocating the flames of war, this most recent insult was like gasoline, causing the great big bonfire to explode, doubled in size and ferocity. And to make matters worse, Louis' ultimatum to the Austrians was not to the Assembly's liking. Quite intentionally, the ultimatum was not an ultimatum, but more of a letter to the editor, couched in conciliatory language and promises at compromise. The Girondins were aghast that such milkweed prattle had been issued from the king. Rousseau's conjecture that traitors, now those who didn't fully and unreservedly commit to war, would be revealed had seemingly been confirmed. Heads had to roll, though still in a proverbial sense at this stage. Now, by denouncing the ultimatum, the Girondins would be indirectly denouncing the king, which was a bad look. But they could denounce the poor bloke who actually wrote the damn thing. This would have two benefits. One, it would diminish the Fouillon-dominated royal ministry, and secondly, it would chastise Louis somewhat for his liberal application of the suspensive veto, which had already scuppered two proposals in only a few months. From within the royal ministry itself, partisan Girondin minister Narbonne harangued and ridiculed his Fouillon compatriots all over the place, with particular ire directed towards his political rival, Minister de Meulville, who was a favourite of Louis. For this indiscretion, he was summarily sacked at the king's order. Narbonne's dismissal triggered an immediate reaction from the Girondins, and here's a good chance to introduce the man behind that response. Rousseau's 2IC, Pierre Victorien Verginaud. Born and raised in Limoges, Limousin, he had enjoyed a life of sumptuous comfort in a well-to-do family. Tutored from a young age in the finer points of history, language and mathematics, the young Verginaud developed a discerning taste for classical literature and language, chiefly because his tutor was a renowned expert in these fields. Packed up and sent to a Jesuit college in Limoges for a further education, he proved to be every bit as talented as his erstwhile tutor. But there was only so far one could get out in the countryside, and it wasn't long before a combination of Verginaud's family connections and his natural talent secured him admittance to the prestigious Collège de Plessis in Paris. These were his reading years. He absolutely devoured any and all classical literature he could lay his hands on. Here, Verginaud developed an enduring belief in Aristotelian moral philosophy and classical intellectualism. Even after completing college and passing his bar exam to become a lawyer, Verginaud didn't stop reading. Perhaps this is why he was regarded as unprofessional and unreliable. The man just didn't work because it would interrupt his reading. But when he did work, well, he worked wonders. Verginaud leveraged his considerable intellect effortlessly and honed wicked wordplay in the courtroom. For some years he practiced law and read in the Gironde, having left Paris behind. Unlike a number of our characters, Verginaud was somewhat insulated from the opening phase of the revolution, though he did watch on enthusiastically. When the revolution did eventually reach the Gironde, he undertook the defence of a number of significant cases in defence of some overzealous revolutionaries, earning him a place among the Gironde's growing community of sympathetic intelligentsia. This early dose of revolution really invigorated Verginaud. For the first time in his life, he had a cause, and he shook off his indolence, intending to enter the fray of French politics. With his good standing and rising popularity, he happily won an appointment to the Gironde's departmental assembly in 1790. Ironically, for a man of classical leanings, now exposed to hardcore revolutionary ideology, Verginaud's tenure as departmental delegate accelerated his radicalization. For over a year, he busied himself with enacting the slew of decrees and laws issued by the National Assembly, becoming an indispensable cog in the machine of the Gironde's revolutionary machine. It was a foregone conclusion, therefore, that when the Legislative Assembly was formed and the departmental delegates had an opportunity to elevate one of their own to the national level, Verginaud was chief on their list. Now, the Girondin movement might well have formed around Brissot, but Verginaud was his right-hand man, always lending his wit and his eloquence to his ideological colleague. With the Girondins' backing, he took a leading role in the Assembly, snatching the presidency for the first half of November and using the podium to shred doves and counter-revolutionaries. Verginaud's real time to shine came in March of 1792, when he demanded that the Tuileries be occupied and the ministers therein be made to capitulate to the Legislative Assembly under threat of violence. Spurred on by Verginaud's tirade, other Girondins joined the chorus and wrote up articles of impeachment on March 9th for Minister Antoine de la Sarre, the guy who wrote the ultimatum. Thomas-Augustin Gasperin only narrowly avoided a similar fate. As an officer, Gasperin knew that it was a bad idea to lead France headlong into a difficult war at a time of acute political instability. This situation was very quickly getting out of hand. Within the Girondin-dominated Legislative Assembly, there was talk of potentially censuring the king. The Feuillants ministry, taking seriously Vergenot's threats of violence, saw the writing on the wall. Almost the entire royal ministry resigned the very next day. This was a final mortal blow to the Feuillants, and perhaps the only remaining check to the inertia of war. The royal ministry was thus restocked with the Girondins and their allies over the course of several weeks. Though the king had the power to hire and fire any of these ministers at will, he was heavily put upon by the Legislative Assembly to permit the installation of what history refers to as the Girondin ministry. And short-lived though it would be, it was instrumental in making the material preparations for war. Two replacements are of particular note to us. Jean-Marie Roland, a former inspector of manufactories, became Minister of the Interior, and the rapidly anti-Austrian soldier-turned-statesman Charles-François Dumouriez became Minister of Foreign Affairs. Dumouriez is going to be pretty important for a while. A bona fide son of the noblesse d'épée, Dumouriez had been trained from a young age in the art of war. Having proven his mettle in the 7 Years' War as an atypically adept leader, he was well positioned to make a name for himself. And so he did, as a spy, a statesman, a diplomat, and a strategist. Now, Dumouriez first got onto the revolutionary radar in 1790. In emulation of the revolution in France, liberals in the Austrian Netherlands launched their own revolution. Dumouriez was sent as a military and diplomatic attaché and developed a close affinity for the Belgians. Quite unlike most of his counterparts in the senior ranks of the army, Dumouriez was actually a genuine supporter of the revolution, but held strong to support for a constitutional monarchy. For this reason, he found a ready cause with the Girondins. While that wasn't the only reason, Dumouriez was on record as detesting the Franco-Austrian alliance. Hell, his hate for the Austrians long predated the revolution. So it was a no-brainer for Brissot when an opportunity arrived to make him Minister of Foreign Affairs. Jacobins, of course, put up objections to the appointment of a brazen warhawk and a proud Girondin, but support from Georges Couthon greased the wheels, and Dumouriez took his new position in March. Heavily influenced by his partisan ministers, Louis was in no position to deny the Legislative Assembly's demand that he follow through on his promise to support the war. To that end, Dumouriez delivered a list of offences and grievances to the Austrians. In turn, the Austrians rejected these grievances as baseless. In Paris, this was interpreted as the justification for war. During proceedings at the Ménage on April 20th, Minister Dumouriez took to the podium to denounce the alliance between France and Austria, reminding all the delegates of his list. A tired and distressed Louis followed after him. Time in the Tuileries had aged him. He was pale and fat, slumping at the shoulders, struggling with short-sightedness. In a voice barely raised above a murmur, he unenthusiastically called for war. All would rather have war than see the dignity of the French people insulted any longer. Having done my best to maintain peace, as I was duty-bound to do, I have now come, in conformity with the terms of the Constitution, to propose war to the National Assembly. Scarcely was the rapturous applause and standing ovation contained to allow for a vote on the declaration of war. 725 delegates voted in favour. 7 voted against. Robespierre, Barnave, Gasperin, and a handful of others. A complete blowout. The Hawks had won. Austria issued their own counter-declaration of war on the 28th, just after positioning some 50,000 troops on their frontier against France in what is today Belgium, and was then a part of the Austrian-controlled lowlands. Against them were some 140,000 French soldiers organised into 3 different army groups. The Armée de Flandre, commanded by General Rochambeau, occupied the northern front. The Armée du Centre sat on the right bank of the Moselle, under the watchful eye of General Lafayette. To the south was the Armée du Rhin, commanded by General Luxner, a veteran general of Bavarian extraction. The French battle plan, devised by Revolutionary War comrades Lafayette and Rochambeau, was characteristically spirited. March east across the Rhine into the Austrian Low Countries and oust the Austrian army. Rochambeau's Armée de Flandre, largest and best equipped, was to take point. But just like their Austrian counterparts, the French army was in a deplorable state, unready for an inspection, let alone a bloody war. Though the Girondin ministry and the generals had done the best they could to ready the troops for a fight, the fact remained that French soldiers marched to war with inadequate supplies, minimal training, and dangerously low morale. Desertions were frequent, mutinies everyday occurrences, and insubordination an escapable reality. Now, some troops were not even issued boots, but instead had to make do with traditional French footwear, a hollowed-out wooden brick called a sabot. But the gravest issue by far was a critical lack of leadership at all levels that crippled the army's ability to function effectively. Over 60% of the French officer corps had left the army, either retiring in protest to the constitutional order or offered their services to the émigrés. When the orders came down on April 28th for the Armée de Flandre to begin its march, the generals knew full well that they were marching towards disaster. But orders are orders, even if they came from foolish politicians and Parisian bureaucrats. Unsurprisingly, things went wrong from the outset. The vanguard, a corps of 5,000 veterans, mostly cavalry, led by experienced Irish-born General Théobald Dillon, set off from Lille. Not long after approaching the town of Tournai, just across the frontier, they were repulsed by enemy cannon, without the enemy cannon having to fire even a single shot. This is because Dillon's supposedly trustworthy veteran cavalry took one look at the bristling ranks of shiny Austrian iron and fled the field right then and there, declaring that they had been betrayed and sent to the slaughter. Chaos ensued when the retreating cavalry collided with a column of infantry, which was itself in the process of withdrawing. The withdrawal soon became a retreat, and the retreat became a rout. After failing to organise the fleeing Frenchmen, Dillon found refuge with a local villager in a nearby cottage. Settling in for the night, Dillon made the place his own. Well, the villager didn't take this intrusion too kindly, and so alerted some nearby soldiers, who promptly carted the general, now without much of his uniform, off to Lille. Mayhem ensued as the still retreating troops poured back into the city, whilst a mob of soldiers lynched Dillon. He had been bayoneted to death and then hung in the traditional revolutionary fashion, au la lanterne, killed by his own men, who accused him of either being a traitor or an impostor. Though the immediate military situation was now dire, the political fallout was just apocalyptic. The severe and inexcusable debacle at Tournai triggered an immediate and near-total loss of faith in the Legislative Assembly and the Girondins. Brissot's promises of a short, sharp war and glory for all France had run up against a harsh reality: the assembled arms of the Archduchy of Austria, soon to be joined by Prussia. And it was this reality that was all too clear to Brissot. Instead of pulling back from the war, a move that would likely have been political suicide, Brissot, Verginaud and Pétion doubled down. Tying into past rumours of a grain conspiracy and noble plots, Brissot invented a conspiracy theory and claimed that a secret cabal of generals, nobles and leading politicians were all in on a plan to undermine the war effort, a spider's web at which the king and queen were at the centre. This fictitious construct was dubbed the Austrian Committee and became Brissot's new weapon in his war against political enemies. And he didn't have to wait long to use it. On May 18th, Lafayette, Rochambeau and Luxembourg convened. They decided to petition the Legislative Assembly to sue for peace with Austria. The war, they believed, could not be won. Their petition, however, only confirmed that the generals were not all in for France. Rather than listen to reason, the Legislative Assembly happily took their petition as proof of the Austrian Committee's existence. And more than that it had wormed its way into the heart of the officer corps. The army could not be trusted. Though they were wrong about a secret conspiracy to sabotage the war effort from on high, the Assembly was right to mistrust her wayward generals. So this is a critical moment. The Legislative Assembly had put all of its eggs in a Brissot-shaped basket, and they were now reeling after that basket's arse had fallen out, scrambling for a chance to retain their legitimacy, to shirk responsibility and redirect blame elsewhere, anything rather than accept that their gamble had failed and their faith in Brissot was misplaced. The Legislative Assembly turned its attentions to enemies not foreign, but domestic. So we now return to those three thorns in the Assembly's side: refractory priests, traitor nobles, and an unreliable king. All falsely implicated in a fabricated conspiracy, this was an excellent opportunity to take out two birds with one stone. Attribute blame to these domestic enemies, and then eliminate them, all under the pretext of preventing another military disaster. To begin, the surveillance law was enacted, which allowed for foreigners, long suspected by revolutionaries, to be placed under surveillance. Truth was, however, that this law was used to justify spying on refractory priests. Having gained ample evidence that their numbers were still large, the Legislative Assembly passed a law on May 27th stripping refractory priests of their rank. Their rights as citizens were suspended, and on the testimony of only a single citizen, refractory priests could then be deported to French Guiana, without appeal. There was no way Louis was ever going to consider allowing such a flagrant assault upon the sanctity of the clergy to pass. The Assembly suspected that he might deploy his veto, and that could not be allowed. Only 2 days after issuing the law to deport refractory priests, the Legislative Assembly broke another clause in the Constitution. By law, he was permitted a personal guard of 6,000 troops. In one fell swoop, almost all of these guards were dismissed, replaced fully by the National Guard. Though Louis already was essentially under house arrest, both he and the Assembly had been eager to maintain the illusion that the king was merely being protected. With the dismissal of his personal guard, that illusion was shattered. The move also ensured that the king had no armed and loyal men nearby for a long suspected but entirely fictional coup attempt. But there was a greater purpose. Installing National Guard meant that the Legislative Assembly could, hopefully, stop Louis firing off so many ill-timed vetoes? Surely he wouldn't dare, now that he was completely isolated. Seeing that he had no alternative, Louis quietly accepted the changes. Over the next few days, even regular troops were replaced by the 20,000 or so National Guard. Paris was under the Assembly's thumb and under strict lockdown. Well, even in spite of his isolation, Louis refused to back down. He might have accepted his new guards, but that didn't mean he had to like it. So he threatened to issue 2 more vetoes. His first was reflexive, to block the deportation of priests. His second was more offensive. The Fête de la Fédérés was coming up, and in came the flood of fédérés into Paris and its surrounds. The Assembly had passed laws permitting this deluge. Problem was that the burden of guarding and corralling these out-of-towners fell to the National Guard, having just recently taken over from the regular troops. For the increasingly haughty and middle-class National Guard, these duties seemed undignified. In fact, the Guard was so incensed that they issued a formal letter of complaint demanding to be reassigned. This scrap was at a low boil when Louis stepped in and threatened to issue a veto barring fédérés from entering the capital. Louis's intended goal was to get on the winning side of a wedge issue between the Guard and their assembly masters. But Louis's gamble backfired badly. Such a nakedly unpatriotic and counter-revolutionary move embroiled him in a nasty political mudfight with his Minister of the Interior, Jean Roland. Not a man to take the initiative, Roland was no doubt prodded by Brissot and other leading Girondins, and most certainly by his shrewd wife, Marie-Jeanne Roland, to write a letter condemning the king's actions. In no uncertain terms, the letter described how Louis would have to make a choice, to support the revolution and thus the proposals of the Assembly, or to support counter-revolutionary reactionaries. Unable to suffer this insult, Louis immediately fired Roland and several other ministers. Dumouriez resigned in solidarity with Roland. With this slew of dismissals, the Girondin ministry was dead, most of the now vacant ministerial positions to be filled by a few lingering feuilles loyal to the king first and foremost. In the climate of conspiracy and suspicion, Louis's heavy-handed response was construed by the people as monarchical reactionism. Where this diaspora of respected ministers intersected with the milieu of radical Parisian street politics, there was an inevitable radicalization. Convinced of Brissot's warnings of an aristocratic counter-revolutionary conspiracy, popular, spontaneous demonstrations broke out throughout the city in solidarity with the ministers. Quickly, these demonstrations turned violent, as lanterns were toppled, government buildings were blockaded, and stores raided. Through the press, the Girondins and Jacobins were happy to muster the discontent of the people for their own political purposes. Aghast at such brazen populism, Lafayette dropped his own bombshell, an official declamation of radical politics and demagoguery, clearly aimed at Brissot and the Girondins. Peace was on the Marquis's mind, but Lafayette's return to military office was not to be a return to political relevance, and the Legislative Assembly, led by men who were estranged from him by both conviction and age, paid absolutely no heed to the letter. Instead, they interpreted it as a final betrayal from Lafayette, whose letter proved his disloyalty. The day after Lafayette delivered his abortive declamation, Louis made good on the threats of his veto. Between Lafayette's letter, the dismissal of popular Girondins from the royal ministry, and now Louis's vetoes, both politicians and Parisians leapt to the conclusion that a counter-revolution was underway. Even the most outlandish and discredited conspiracies were lent credence, prompting a vicious bout of political infighting. In the hall of the Manège, the Hôtel de Beauvais, the Hôtel de Ville, and the various meeting places of Parisian political clubs and government organs, absolute chaos reigned. There was some fighting between left and right. The left accused the right of fomenting dissent and of intentionally sabotaging the war effort to allow an Austrian army to march into Paris, but most of the blows were traded between the loosely aligned clubs and factions that constituted the political left. The Jacobin Club, in particular, already bifurcated by Robespierre's pacifism and Brissot's brinkmanship, became embroiled in a journalistic civil war, with various publications and press outlets turning their propagandistic cannon on their own side. As the left began to cannibalize itself, the right rallied. The increasing severity and frequency of violent civil disobedience concerned them immensely. Elements from among the military, the Assembly, and the Royal Ministry agreed that something stern had to be done to restore order. It was Lafayette, in particular, who advocated, however reluctantly, for preparations to be made for a hypothetical future confrontation with the mob. Playing right into Brissot's hands, Lafayette conducted secret peace talks with the Austrians. And he wasn't alone. Half the officer corps and remaining nobles were already in the process of hedging their bets this way. Inevitably, all the infighting, the politicking, the hedge betting crippled the Legislative Assembly going into June. As crises emerged, news from the front grew dire. They were caught completely off balance by yet another avalanche of radical, revolutionary populism. So, a losing war, a failing government, a counter-revolutionary king. It seemed to the people of Paris that the great big project of revolution was flaming out around them. And yet, the revolution had a life of its own, embedded irrevocably in the hearts and minds of common Parisians. As the revolution was at its lowest ebb within the halls of power, revolutionary zeal was at an all-time high among the poor, disenfranchised masses. Joining the tens of thousands already out in the streets, the sans-culottes rose up in unison, wresting control of the capital away from the authorities. Now the sans-culottes, as we have seen, have already made an indelible mark upon the course of the revolution as something of a loose cannon on deck. It was usually at the instigation of the Corrégy Club, and even then not as a single all-encompassing entity, that the sans-culottes had rallied. But this time was different. The leaders of the sans-culottes, legendary radicals such as Rossignol, Claude Lazovsky, and of course the incorrigible Antoine Santerre, had little trouble in cultivating enough popular uproar to convince the people of Paris to rise up in protest to their lack of political representation. Each section, a section being a suburb of Paris controlled by the sans-culottes, entered into open revolt. Independently, the sections were arming themselves with muskets and poured out onto the barricaded streets to engage in what might charitably be called some civil disobedience. And with that, the streets of Paris descended into complete and utter pandemonium, unprecedented in scale or ferocity even by prior outbursts such as the fall of the Bastille or the Day of the Market Women. Ad hoc barricades were hastily assembled and then manned. Bonfires were lit, in which clerical and aristocratic memorabilia were thrown. Civic spaces were occupied by protesters and fédérés. Shops, homes and depots of suspected counter-revolutionaries were sacked. Around them, all the sans-culottes saw were enemies, real or imagined. Traitor generals, counter-revolutionary delegates, disloyal priests, and worst of all, a corrupted king who plotted in secret his escape, or worse still, a royalist coup. Even as the situation on the streets was rapidly deteriorating, the leaders of the sans-culottes conferred with the Corrégy Club on how best to use the people to deliver an unambiguous rejection of Louis's counter-revolutionary antics. Disparate and independent uprisings were not enough. Something more resolute and far more symbolic was deemed necessary. Preparations were being made for a great demonstration, a journée, planned to occur on June 20th. With something of a horticultural bent yet again, a tree of liberty would be planted in the garden of the Tuileries, in plain view of the king. Quite on purpose, the organisers decided that the demonstration would not be a peaceful one. They went armed. If push came to shove, their tree of liberty would be watered with blood. Out in the eastern suburbs of Paris, the sections of the Faubourg Saint-Germain and the Faubourg Saint-Antoine rose as one on the morning of June 20th. Gathering literally in the shade of the partially demolished Bastille, over 8,000 sans-culottes were armed with anything they could get their hands on. Pitchforks, spears, daggers, rusty axes and chipped spades. Some had muskets. And among their number were even a few disgruntled National Guardsmen, whose reasons for joining with the sans-culottes varied from disdain at the direction of government or solidarity with their revolutionary brothers and sisters. Whatever the reasons, the sans-culottes set off west. Having already convened earlier in the morning, the Legislative Assembly was well into their day's debates when a small delegation burst through the doors of the Manège. They brandished a petition calling for the active-passive distinction to be removed. Desperately trying to maintain order above the petitioners, the delegates, and the crowd of jeering onlookers amassed on the balconies above, President Dinantz managed to talk down the intruders. Quite peaceably, they dutifully slinked back out the door they'd come through, as the delegates discussed just how best to proceed. Faced with the prospect of an armed mob potentially forcing entrance into the Manège, the Assembly agreed to admit the petitioners again, but only if they were on their best behaviour. But this time, the petitioners did not enter alone. Though the delegates had permitted more than merely the petitioners to enter, I doubt they expected the full 8,000 sans-culottes to parade through, literally through, the heart of French government. Stupefied delegates watched on as a group of strong-backed Parisians hauled a table onto which was pinned the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Trailing behind them were ragged red and blue flags or strips of cloth bearing the sans-culottes' most popular slogans: Mort aux tyrans, or Vivent les sans-culottes, death to tyrants, or long live the sans-culottes. But the most shocking display was reserved right for the end. A plump, bloody bovine heart impaled on a pike, representing the skewered heart of an aristocrat. As unambiguous and unmistakable a display of the sans-culottes' political philosophy as the stunned delegates ever got. And this whole thing was not quiet. Revolutionary slogans, shouted expletives, revolutionary songs, chanting and stamping. To close the incredible display, Santerre sauntered into the hall. Without a word, he took a red and blue flag and tossed it on the floor, the gauntlet set before the Legislative Assembly. Even as sans-culottes were still funneling through the Manège, their advanced elements were parading up the roads that ran parallel to the Seine. The first of these protesters arrived at the Tuileries probably around midday. They did their usual thing, setting up barricades, listening to speeches, brandishing their weapons, waving flags, chanting death to tyrants and burning effigies. Par for the course, really. Louis, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence in his second-story apartment room, likely unable to bring himself to look out the window at the brooding mob. But no doubt he recognised their unmistakable din. His fourth angry mob in 3 years. By the account of the Queen's maid, Louis had been reduced to a state of catatonic despondency by recent political reversals and the near-total evaporation of his remaining popular support. June 20th was his 10th day in this state. A dark mood had ensnared the king. A dark mood was also developing outside his window, in the mob. As more and more protesters amassed on the Rue du Carrousel out on the front of the Tuileries, a switch was flicked. By around 4 o'clock that afternoon, the protest reached critical mass. The thousands of National Guardsmen posted around the Tuileries, there to prevent just such an event as this, while their hands were tied, they were ordered not to disperse the mob. And so, it was not long before the tall outer gates of the inner-city palace were penetrated. The Porte Royale, a side entrance, was either forced open, or perhaps even left open by some dissentious guardsmen. But the result was the same either way. With an outlet for their pent-up fury, the sans-culottes stormed the Tuileries. They flooded into its opulent gardens and enclosed grounds. Hundreds rushed inside, looting precious valuables, stealing fixtures and furniture. Arsonists honed their skills, lighting some impressive conflagrations as yet more sans-culottes raided every room and chamber of the palace. A cannon was even wheeled upstairs, but fortunately it was not to be used. With the mob literally hacking away at the door, the Queen and the young Dauphin were whisked away and cloistered in the council chambers. Their only protection was furniture piled high at the door and a few die-hard loyalists. The rest of the guardsmen had either stood aside or were busy dealing with fires. Louis could have gone with his wife and son, but he chose not to, instead moving into a small antechamber. It was not long before he too was cornered. It's difficult to know just what was going through Louis's mind at this point. Was he resigned to a gruesome death then and there? Was this to be his ignoble end? Or, would like at Varenne, he managed to talk his way out of a noose, and rely upon the politicking of his remnant supporters to keep him alive a little longer, long enough for this nasty revolution to peter out. He didn't have much time to ponder. The doors didn't hold up against the sustained onslaught of hatchets and axes. As the sans-culottes flooded in, Louis was roused from his torpor, and stood proudly at the threshold. His first real words in 10 days were defiant. "Here I am." Madame Elizabeth threw herself at Louis in a vain attempt to bodily protect him. Some of the sans-culottes mistook Elizabeth for the Queen, and it's very possible that they would have killed her and the King right then and there, had it not been for the timely intercession of a group of guardsmen led by Louis Legendre, a Cordelier Club leader. Legendre mollified the sans-culottes and negotiated the release of Louis to a larger room, to make space for the rapidly growing crowd. With his frighteningly loud voice, Legendre spoke above the crowd and listed off the demands defined by their petition. Point by point he went, as Louis, by now forced to stand atop a motley stage made of furniture, listened on in silence, surrounded on all sides by his loyal, bayonet-brandishing guardsmen. When Legendre finished, Louis responded, echoing the calls of the sans-culottes. "Vive la nation! The people have no better friend than I." The king was then offered a simple red cap, the famous Phrygian cap. It had its origins in the Roman Republic, where freedmen often wore the cap. With the rise of republicanism within the revolutionary body politique came a slew of allusions, some literal and some symbolic, to the classical republicanism of antiquity. The written works of ancient philosophers were making a comeback, and French scholars encouraged a resurgence of classical scholasticism in academia. Even the great building projects undertaken in Paris drew deliberate inspiration from Roman architecture. It's no mistake that the front face of the Palais Royal looks like the Pantheon in Rome. And it's from this glance to the past that the Phrygian cap came, adopted as the symbol of the sans-culottes, now freedmen, not slaves. Taking the proffered cap, Louis had some trouble putting it on his wigged head, dropping it a few times in the process. After a fashion, though, he had it on, at which point he was offered a bottle of red wine and asked to toast the revolution. Louis complied, scoffing the wine with a toast to the people. "They have no better friend than I," he said. Legendre interrupted this display of king-subject solidarity with a reminder to Louis. Put your money where your mouth is. Withdraw your 2 vetoes. But somewhere in between being aroused from sedated rumination and downing some red wine, Louis had found his backbone. Dutch courage, perhaps? Maybe. Really, Louis was probably ready to die the minute the mob burst into the room. I think it more likely that Louis put on a stern show to preserve the lives of his wife and son, besieged as they were only a few rooms away. Surrounded on all sides, King Louis refused to parley. He would not revoke his vetoes. For him, it was an unconscionable injustice, not only to openly defy the Catholic Church, but also to condemn the nobility, his most ardent and erstwhile advocates. Legendre wouldn't take no for an answer, though. The stalemate was only broken with the sudden arrival of a deputation from the Paris Commune, headed by Mayor Pétion. He claimed, disingenuously, to have only just recently heard of the day's events, rich considering he had been within earshot of the Sans-Culottes as they marched past the Hôtel de Ville. But nonetheless, he managed to convince Legendre and the other Sans-Culottes to leave the king in peace. Somewhat anticlimactically, the whole thing fizzled out, and the Sans-Culottes went home. Louis was clearly exhausted by his ordeal. He slumped into a large chair, but not before throwing his cap onto the floor with undisguised contempt. This most recent insult against the royal family triggered a not unremarkable but still fairly inconsequential reversal in fortune for both monarchists and constitutionalists. Louis won accolades in the Parisian press, even from some radical left-wing propagandists, for his resolve in the face of an armed mob. Even the Sans-Culottes came away from the march with a begrudging respect for the fat little man they fully expected to kowtow without resistance. So all in all, the journée had backfired, and the protesters were condemned from across the political spectrum and from all across France's provinces too. The Feuillants took advantage of public opinion and used it to leverage some bipartisan support for measures intended to protect the king and his royal prerogatives. Lafayette's proposals for sterner measures to be taken against the mob were now heeded, but without much input from the Marquis himself, who was now persona non grata in Parisian politics. This is because he had left his position in the Army of the North to return to Paris in an attempt to popularize the message of his letter from a few weeks earlier. But this was all taking place against the backdrop of continued hostilities with the Austrians and Prussians. Enemy armies were menacing the French frontiers, threatening to invade France proper. That Lafayette was in Paris, and not at the border, was a grave dereliction of duty. And besides, who wanted a mediocre general with, at best, strained political credentials, telling them to suppress political clubs and crush the mob? When Lafayette made a personal plea to the Jacobin Club in one of their meetings in the Church of Saint-Jacques, asking that they condemn the actions of June 20th, he was heckled and ridiculed mercilessly. So he turned to his old post in the National Guard and sought to be reinstated as their leader. But even the National Guard were distant. They would not tolerate a traitor to be their leader. Even the royal family would have none of the Marquis. To quote the Queen herself, better to perish than to be saved by Monsieur de Lafayette. The hero of the liberal revolution was again left dejected and despised. Seeing no alternative, Lafayette resumed with the Army of the North, serving alongside Rochambeau once again. But even though the messenger was disdained, the message rang true. The mobs had to be contained. The Sans-Culottes were messing things up royally. Battle lines were now being formed where they hadn't existed before. The roller coaster of Parisian revolutionary politics had been a bumpy, torrid ride, but had not yet truly descended into commonplace, politically motivated violence. A former monarchine could expect to transition into the Feuillants without much more than a loss of political fortune and maybe some influence. Certainly, to be on the wrong side of an issue in the Legislative Assembly was not a death sentence. But the tempo of revolutionary politics was now increasing, and the delegates could scarcely keep up. The course of the revolution was not being dictated by government, but rather in response to what was happening on the streets. And what was happening on the streets was vicious wall-to-wall chaos, all spearheaded by the Sans-Culottes. The course of the revolution had to be corrected, the battle lines drawn clearly for all to see. There were those in the majority who wanted to reclaim the revolution for the constitutional order. These were the Girondins. On the other hand, there were those revolutionary populists who liked the direction the radical street politics were heading, and they were willing to let the revolution be carried forth less so from the Manège and more so from the Champs-Élysées, these guys being the radical Jacobins and the Couraille Club. And rest assured, To be on the wrong side of this divide would not mean a mere loss of station or prestige. This was now life and death. And it was a matter of life and death for the nation itself. Austrian, Prussian, and Royalist armies had repulsed haphazard attacks with ease. And now they crossed the borders, plunging deep into France. Out east in Alsace, the army of the Rhine braced for impact. They knew that enemy forces were on their way right now, intent upon laying siege to Strasbourg. With word of the defeats suffered up north in the Austrian Netherlands, the city's defenders were demoralized and distraught. When the time came and the bullets started flying, it wasn't clear that they would stand their ground. No one knew this better than Philippe Frédéric de Dietrich, mayor of Strasbourg. Somewhat naively, the mayor believed that a suitably stirring patriotic jig might just liven up the spirits of the troops. To that end, he called upon a young captain of the engineers, Claude-Joseph Rouget de Lille, to write such a song. Always poetically inclined, de Lille took to the task with vigour. His song called for citizens to take up arms and fight for France against the bloody standard of tyranny. De Lille called this finished piece the war song of the Army of the Rhine. It was not yet known as La Marseillaise. That would come a few months later, by which time de Lille's Girondin sympathies were laid bare. But by then, the song had spread far and wide, being particularly popular among Revolutionary National Guardsmen and volunteer soldiers. Like no other song, La Marseillaise imbued the citizens and soldiers of France with a grim resolve: to hold back the forces of tyranny and preserve the gains of the revolution.